know, Andrew, I have been waiting for this one for a long time because, yes, I am excited to talk to Jay Dobyns, who we'll talk about in just a second, but I'm also excited for you to talk to Jay Dobyns because this is another one of those interviews that is Andrew Iden catnip.
Yeah, I have long had a fascination with biker culture and outlaw biker gangs and just kind of the whole universe. And Jay Dobyns spent years working for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, and he infiltrated the Hells Angels and worked on the other side of the wall as an undercover operative.
Let's pause and just let that process for a second. Let's repeat it for a second. He, as a member of the ATF, joined the Hells Angels as an undercover agent and led a large undercover operation that took a whole lot of them down.
Yeah. And in the outlaw biker universe, there is no one bigger than the Hells Angels. They are the mythical group. I mean, there's a ton of gangs, biker gangs like this, but nobody has gotten more publicity or more run than the Hells Angels. And Jay managed to get through that wall and earn the trust of those guys and had fascinating stories.
And even before that happened, he was a legend he was involved in such historical crime cases, from Oklahoma City to Columbine.
Yeah, before he even gets to wearing the vest.
Yeah,
he's at Waco, he's at Oklahoma City, he's at Columbine. He's got this amazing career of really defining events in American, history.
Yeah, and before that, he was a star college football player. I mean, he is a fascinating character, and when you talk to him, he's really humble about it all, right? Like he's the first to say, "I'm no big deal." I would say that we would humbly disagree.
Indeed. So here's Jay Dobyns, also known as Jay Bird Davis. So Jay, knowing kind of your story and knowing your life, it's kind of hard to figure out where to start. Let's just go ahead and start with, how did you get into law enforcement and how did you get into biker gang culture, the Hells Angels, the whole thing? Let's just go ahead and start there.
Well, to be honest with you, a lot of it was by accident. I started in law enforcement because I was a failed athlete. I played college football. I had a successful college football career. That was always my plan A, was to play professional football. I figured out I would figure out everything else, on the back end from that. And when it came down to it, I wasn't as good as I thought I was. I wasn't good enough to play at that level. And like a lot of young people, you put all your eggs in one basket and then that basket breaks, and all your eggs break and you're lost. And this is a little bit hokey, but if I didn't give you the honest answer, it would be counterfeit. The television show Miami Vice was very popular at the time. And, as an audience, like really all we had seen was police procedurals. We'd uniformed cops responding to calls, detectives responding to crime scenes and conducting traditional investigations. And then Miami Vice shows up. And Sonny Crockett's like rolling around South Beach and he's, got a Hugo Boss suit on. He's driving a Ferrari.
A Ferrari Testarossa.
There you go.
Yes.
There's tons of cocaine on the table and stripper models are bringing him mojitos. I was convinced that the glamour and the sexiness of that life, like Hollywood tricked me. Hollywood made me believe that was real. I ultimately learned that it's not sexy. It's not glamorous. The life of an undercover agent is a nasty, dirty, bloody, vomit-covered scab of a life. But when I realized the truth, man, I loved it every day. When my alarm clock went off, I couldn't wait to go to work. I felt like I had a purpose. I felt like I stood for something. And so I kind of stumbled into law enforcement work, but as I landed there, I grew to really love it.
You mentioned you had a purpose, and I think that is something that a lot of people don't have, or it's something that they're searching for their entire life. And it sounds like you found it early. At what point did that click for you? Like, how far were you into it before you realized this is my purpose?
Well, I had like kind of an adventurous start. I got hired on a Monday. 4 days later, I was taken hostage and shot. And so, like, I had a rough opening act to my career, but I was resilient and I was determined to succeed. So over the course of my career and learning the job, I was involved in and responded to like some very big historical events in our country's like crime and punishment history. I responded to the LA riots after the cops that were in the assault of Rodney King were acquitted. I mean, LA was on fire. I was out there in the middle of that. The squad car I was rolling in was sniped while we were patrolling in Watts. I responded to ATF's raid on the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, and all the things that transpired there. I responded to the Columbine High School massacre. That event is probably where my attitude turned. I was walking through that crime scene. And so the people, your audience that's familiar with that school shooting, a lot of the battle damage took place in the library at Columbine High School. And so there's dead kids and there's pools of blood and all those things associated with a massacre. But what really affected me and burned into my brain was in the cafeteria where the assault started. Yep. There was book bags, backpacks scattered everywhere. And then amidst these backpacks were these propane tanks like that you'd use to hook up to your gas grill with pipe bombs strapped on them. The original plan for Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold was to detonate those propane tanks and basically ignite the cafeteria and try to like start shooting those that survived that attack as they tried to exit.
They tried to ignite those, right?
Yeah, and they had barricaded exits, and they had a master plan of how it was going to be executed. But like I was super angry that day, walking through that cafeteria and imagining those kids who came to school that day to do what kids do at school, like go to class, hang out with their friends, chase their girlfriends around, go to their clubs and their sports practices afterwards. And the vision of the terror that those kids were experiencing in those moments, I kind of reset my focus, and it was designed to go after bad people doing bad things to good people. And it was that generic, but that's where my mind landed after that experience.
And that's interesting because that happened about 10 years into your career in federal law enforcement, Columbine, right?
Yeah, I think I got hired in 87, and I think Columbine was 95, if I'm
99, April of 99.
99,
yeah.
99, correct. My reference to 95 is that I worked a case that was tied to the Oklahoma City bombing.
Yeah.
When, after Timothy McVeigh, detonated his car bomb outside the Murrah Federal Building, there was remnants of his crew and people that had helped him organize and plan that, like in the Las Vegas, Northwest Arizona area. If you recall that investigation, Terry Nichols spent time with him, one of his co-conspirators out there. And then another of his co-conspirators named Michael Fortier was in Kingman, Arizona. And so my partner and I were sent to the Las Vegas area to try to infiltrate what was left of Timothy McVeigh's crew. And in the process, we crossed paths with a guy who was planning to mimic Oklahoma City, like do an Oklahoma City Part 2. And he had plans and intentions to blow up 3 Las Vegas casinos. And so we infiltrated that scheme. And, he was using C4 devices and had a pretty elaborate plan. He had blue lines and blueprints of the casinos and extensive negotiations on that. But that was probably the most impactful case that I worked on. It didn't get a ton of publicity, but you don't have to have a crystal ball to imagine what kind of carnage would have been created by detonating C4 devices inside the lobbies of Las Vegas Casino.
So by the time you get to infiltrating the Hells Angels and the biker gangs and biker culture, I've read a lot about how, you've talked about why you were chosen or why it was you that became the person to kind of get inside the walls, right? And hearing you talk about all of these things, these huge, incredibly violent, incredibly graphic things that you had to deal with, by the time you get to the Hells Angels biker culture, you're pretty hardened already, are you not?
When that opportunity was presented to me, I had about 15 years of undercover experience underneath my belt. So, and I'd bought guns, big and small, multiples, from handguns to shoulder launched rockets. I'd bought narcotics, from street dope, dime bags and 8 balls, to cartel level dope. Explosive devices, from homemade PVC pipe bombs to improvised C4 IEDs. I'd worked home invasion cases and murder for hire cases. And so
for a long time, for most of your undercover career before the Hells Angels, that was sort of your bread and butter, right?
Absolutely. 15 years of that.
Yeah.
When the opportunity was proposed to make a run at the Hells Angels in Arizona, and even with all that experience, my initial reaction to my case agent, I was approached by a case agent named Joe Slatella, who was just an amazing, complex case manager. He's one of these guys that is able to hold and process like huge amounts of intelligence and information in his mind and reference it instantly. I had a ton of respect and love and admiration for Joe. And when he came to me, my first reaction was, man, I'm not the right guy for this. I can name 10 or 12 guys now that are probably more prepared and will do a better job for you in this role than I'm capable of. But Joe convinced me to give it a try to lead the undercover team. And mainly is because I had a head start. I had an established undercover residence in Bullhead City, Arizona. I had already been working a case up there. There was some bounty hunters that were out of control up there. And in that bounty hunter case, I was already crossing paths with members of the Hells Angels. So I wasn't this cold unknown coming into the case. I already had my feet on the ground,
right?
Which Joe convinced me, like you got a head start. Let's take advantage of that.
If I'm understanding the infrastructure of that case correctly, you guys created an entirely fake biker gang. Is that right?
That's close.
Yeah.
Not entirely accurate. What we did is there was a biker gang that was based in Tijuana, Mexico, known as the Solo Angels, Solo Angeles. We had a source into that gang, and we basically negotiated our way and infiltrated the Solo Angels gang, not to investigate them for their crimes, but to use their patch and wear their patch in Arizona to have some street cred in the eyes of the Hells Angels, that we were already a part of that world. And it worked beautifully.
The patches thing, that is such an important piece of symbology in the biker world. Can you explain a little bit about the significance of that and having that patch?
Yeah, the way that biker gangs format their vests, their jackets, in that world is little things are very important. In the outlaw biker gang world, the outlaw motorcycle gang world, they wear 3-piece patches, which have a bottom rocker, which symbolizes where they're from, typically their state, sometimes their country, their top rocker, which is typically the name of their gang, and then they'll have a center patch, which is their logo or their insignia. So in the case of the Hells Angels, there was a Hells Angels top rocker, their death head, that flying winged skull center patch, and then, for most of the people that I dealt with, they had Arizona bottom rockers. But that's when I refer to the patch, or sometimes it's called a cut. They're cut-offs. The sleeves are cut off. That's what I'm speaking of.
Mm-hmm. Before we get into what you did to the Hells Angels. I think it'd be interesting to get a little bit of context about who the Hells Angels are, because a lot of people may think of them as, you said, like these rascally biker guys, or people know about them from what happened with the Rolling Stones at Altamont in the early 70s. But you infiltrated them in, I believe, the early 2000s, right? And what is the state of the Hells Angels at this point? What are they doing? What are you trying to stop?
They were operating violently and with impunity in Arizona. No one was really looking at them, and they were running out of control, and they knew they were running out of control. They were running unchecked. So as an investigator, when I accepted this assignment, typically my routine was that I want to know as much about the suspects, as much about the targets as I possibly can. Knowledge is power for law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And so in my research, I realized these guys have their PhDs in violence and intimidation. They spent over 50 years living that lifestyle. There's 5,000 members worldwide, like 500 charters. They're in 60 different countries. But the thing that really jumped out for me, aside from the myth and the legend and the Americana that the Hells Angels have become, the thing that really spoke to me was that they kill their own. They had a long track record and history of murdering their own members, their own brotherhood, if they felt compromised or betrayed.
And so, again, it's very much like the mafia in that way.
Nearly identical. You do not cross the machine, because the machine will trample you and keep going.
What sort of enterprise were they involved with in Arizona? Was it gun running, human trafficking, drugs? What was it, or all of it? What was the sort of their sphere?
If you can imagine the large scope of violent crime, we would spend less time, we would waste less time if I told you what they weren't involved in.
Yeah.
Because it's a shorter list. Murder, rape, gun running, drug trafficking, extortions, assaults, murder for hire, witness intimidations. Every aspect of violence, if there was money attached to it, or a payday attached to it, or if it somehow elevated the gang, protected the gang, represented or defended their status, they had their fingers in it.
So, Jay, how do you infiltrate a biker gang?
We were very innovative in our approach. At that time, the Hells Angels had never been fully infiltrated by a law enforcement officer. And we repeatedly heard from the experts, it's impossible. You can't do it. That was law enforcement's perspective. And that was also the Hells Angels' perspective. They were like, these other gangs, like agents and officers, are sneaking under their wire, but no one's getting under ours. And the way they insulated themselves is in that prospecting period. A lot of other gangs, 30, 60, 90 days prospecting, where they're examining you and testing you to see if you're worthy of being a member of their gang. With the Hells Angels, it was a minimum mandatory 1 year prospecting period. That was how they perceived to be insulating themselves from an insulation. That their mentality was, there isn't a cop out there that can keep up with us, that can go as hard and as fast as we do over the course of a year before we'll sniff them out.
And in order to join and become patched in to the Angels, you have to commit a homicide, right?
Andrew, that in my experience, that is urban legend.
Okay.
I don't believe, someone could prove me wrong, I don't believe that every member of the Hells Angels has a homicide on their belt. A lot of them do. A lot of them are ready, willing, and able to. We ended up fabricating a homicide for our final push towards membership, but I believe we would have got membership without that.
Tell us about that. Like, how do you fabricate a homicide? Like, was there pressure on you to commit one to prove to them?
Well, there wasn't. And a little bit earlier in our conversation, Dan, we were talking about like how do you get inside the wire of these guys?
Yeah.
This gang that has risen beyond the world and stories of crime and punishment and actually become part of Americana. We did it through innovation and through street theater. And street theater is inaccurate conclusions formed behind accurate observations. So they would accurately see me wearing a Solo Angel vest. Mm-hmm. They inaccurately concluded I was part of a biker gang. from very small to much more complex. On the small end, I always had bulletproof vests at my house. People would come and see bulletproof vests laying around. I didn't have to speak to that. How many houses do you go to and you see people with bulletproof vests laying around, right? I carried a baseball bat with me all the time. Who carries a baseball bat with them? I didn't have to speak to it. My cover story was that I was a gun runner, I was a debt collector, and I was a contract killer. They formed in their own mind, oh, he must carry that baseball bat around with him when he's doing his debt collections. We set up skits and plays and invited the Hells Angels to either witness them or be participants in them.
Can you give an example of something like that, like a skit?
You know, we did gun deals in their presence. We did drug deals in their presence. There was beatings that took place in their presence. We had a chop shop that we used. I did debt collections in their presence. What they didn't understand is that the Hells Angels, what they were seeing, the skit they were seeing, the scene that they were a participant in, was entirely being acted out by cops, by undercover cops, who all had a script and all had a role to play. So with Dan and Andrew on this conversation, if I'm going to Andrew and I'm going to go do a debt collection, and I say, Dan, come with me, man. It's going to be an easy payday for you. All I need you to do is watch my back. And then I go to Andrew and you're sitting on my shoulder and I take his watch and I take his wallet and I take his rings and I take his money and I threaten him that if he doesn't have the rest of what's owed in another week, I'm going to crack him on the back of the head with my baseball bat. And he's going to have to figure out how to even up his debt from a hospital bed. And then we leave. And Dan, I cash you out in the parking lot for watching my back and protecting me. You believe you were just part of a debt collection. You saw it. You smelled it. You touched it. You were paid for it. We did that over and over and over again. Those types of scenarios, it was impossible for them not to believe me. You know, they're angry that they were deceived. And I understand that no one likes being betrayed.
Sure.
No one does. We've all at one point or other to various degrees been betrayed somewhere in our life, even if it was just our junior high girlfriend that got caught making out with somebody else, right? We all know how that feels. I understand their anger, but if they would step back and say, man, these guys went above and beyond and they were really, really good at what they did, it would actually lighten their load a little bit. We would have gotten anybody with the way that we were operating.
What you're describing is sounds like such a team effort, which is a lot different than what you envision when you think about someone who's undercover, right? You know, someone who's out in the cold, all super deep out on their own, and they meet with their contact from the department once every month or whatever. But what you're describing, the street theater, police willing to take beatings for this, this sounds like a lot of undercover work is much more of a team effort than most people would think.
Dan, you're spot on. And, you actually beat me to the punch. I was going to say, in my experience, and I did undercover work for 27 years, I never, not one single time, ever accomplished anything of significance alone. I always had great investigators, great detectives, great task force officers around me that put in every bit of time, effort, energy, blood, sweat, and tears into the investigations that I did. Oftentimes what happens is in the end, after an investigation, whether it be the bombing case we worked in Las Vegas, the Hells Angels infiltration, murder for hires, home invasion cases, whatever you want to label it, there's typically one person left at the end of the day that either gets the credit for that or sometimes takes the blame for it. But with this Hells Angels investigation and every other investigation I worked on, I was surrounded by agents and detectives and lawmen and lawwomen who were probably all better at the job than I was. They helped me do great things.
And all of this was part of something called Operation Black Biscuit. And you mentioned earlier that the Hells Angels are very similarly structured and they operate in many of the same ways, as the mafia. It's organized crime. So it sounds like you guys are trying to get them on RICO charges, and you did eventually.
We did. Ultimately, I think we indicted 55 members and associates of the Hells Angels. 16 of them were indicted on RICO charges. And once we had the indictments in place, which came very quickly after we faked the murder and convinced the Hells Angels that we'd committed a murder on their behalf, the indictments came fairly quickly after that. And then a very traditional end to the investigation. You know, the SWAT team comes in and makes arrests and conducts raids and all those things that we're used to seeing on television and police shows.
I mean, how did you manage to get out? Like, how is it that you are able to like sit and talk to us today, go about your life on this side of the Hells Angel? Most people don't come back out once they're in.
You know, when the case ended and when the Hells Angels learned that Jaybird Davis, the gun runner, debt collector, hitman, was actually Jay Dobyns, an ATF agent, the tiger doesn't change his stripes. You know, the violence and the threats were real. I had murder contracts placed on me. They were farmed out to other organized crime groups, the Aryan Brotherhood, the MS-13, 18th Street was looking at it. There were lone wolf assassins. There was a Hells Angels hitman from Stockholm, Sweden, found in Tucson, Arizona, who'd come over the border at Mexico, which made absolutely no sense to me. I got in a fist fight with a bunch of Hells Angels on a Southwest flight inside the tube of an air, inside the passenger compartment of an airplane. Like, I'm fist fighting with Hells Angels.
They know you're a federal agent?
They knew who I was.
Yeah.
They knew that not only I was a federal agent, they knew that exactly who I was.
Right.
There were threats against my kids. There were threats against my wife. There was letters being written out of the prison, like coaching members on the outside as to how to kill us. The summer of 2008, my house was burned to the ground by assassins, by arsonists and assassins, I suppose. And so, you know, Andrew, to get back to your question, like, how do you operate like publicly? First of all, I'm not looking for a fight. I don't want to fight. I'll walk away from a fight if I have to. I'll run away from it if you give me the opportunity to. Just don't corner me or my family, because the way we resolve it at that point is not going to be pleasant for anybody. We're all going to the hospital. And what I couldn't do, what I wouldn't allow myself to do, is to hide. I tried to like kind of vanish for a little bit and let things cool off. It doesn't work. And in today's world, like, you really can't hide. What I didn't want to be is I didn't want to become Osama bin Laden, hiding in some cave somewhere, waiting for the Navy SEALs to shoot a rocket up my ass.
Yeah.
I was like, if I hide, if I let them control my life, they win. They'd still be controlling me. They'd still be hanging over me. I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I don't have an axe to grind with anybody. But I think also time tends to, I don't know that it necessarily healed anything in the eyes of the Hells Angels, but time does work to calm things down. And maybe it's just as simply that they found new people to hate more than they do me. You
retired in 2014. What made you decide to get out?
You know what? I had a pretty rough exit with ATF. I got into a dispute with a handful of my supervisors over what I believe to be the mishandling of the threats that me and my family faced.
Which were still going on to that day from Black Biscuit.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, but like I retired on my terms at my time. You know, I had 27 years of service. And when I left, I looked back at where it started. Like I said, 27 years earlier, getting shot the first week on the job, going through other shootings, all kinds of ups and downs, successes and failures. And I look back with satisfaction that, like I said earlier, Dan, I didn't always get it right, but every day I tried my hardest. I did the best I could.
After you retired, as you mentioned earlier, you get addicted to the rush. Once that rush wasn't there anymore, what do you do with your life? What was post-retirement like? How'd you cope?
Yeah, well, I think that not just myself, I think a lot of law men and women that spend any extensive period on the time, when they're gone, they're like, what is my purpose now? Like, what is my meaning? What do I stand for? Like, who am I impacting? how am I impacting people? And there's a lot of zeros there sometimes. Like sometimes you're just not anymore. I've been very blessed to continue involvement in law enforcement and to keep my fingers in the game by doing training. I provide training. I keynote at a lot of law enforcement events. More opportunities than I can actually fulfill, to be quite honest with you. I coach high school football, or have coached high school football, which I get a lot of satisfaction from. And it's very much unlike the law enforcement game. There's elements to it that overlap. There's elements that overlap between sports and coaching and high school football and law enforcement. You know, a couple things like I tell the kids that play for me, if you want something that you've never had in your life, you're going to have to do things you've never done to get it. If you want people to remember your name, you have to do something they can never forget. Really, like, you know, in the middle of a football game, which is like the middle of an undercover operation, the middle of a law enforcement career, things are not always going to go according to plan, and no one is coming to save you. Yep. You have to learn to save yourself.
It reminds me of a Steve Martin quote when people ask him what it takes to make it, to break through, to be successful, to be remembered. He said, be so good that they can't ignore you.
Yeah, I think that, you know, and that's along that line, like practice, which is whether you're practicing as a football player, whether you're guiding a football team as a coach, whether you're rehearsing your role as an undercover operative, like rehearse it and practice it to the point where not that you just get it right, but where you can't get it wrong.
Yeah.
Jay, I think about your life, and if it were to play out in a film or something, and during this conversation, I've thought about the final scene and you being sitting at a stoplight and 5 motorcycles pull up next to you and you're just kind of living your life retired.
Andrew has an active imagination.
I do. My question is, what do you think? What goes through your mind when you're sitting at a light and a group of bikers pull up? You know the life that some of those guys are living.
I think that regardless of what it is we do, whether you're an undercover agent, you're an athlete, you're a businessman, you're podcast hosts, any of us can be good or average, great, sometimes excellent. But there's a handful of people that are trying to be elite. And to be elite, to truly become elite at anything, you have to be obsessed with it. And so, you know, I'm sitting at a stoplight in your hypothetical and 5 Hell's Angels pull up to me. I understand firsthand the obsession that they have had to have in order to put that patch on their back. You know what, man? They're just not to be messed with. They're some of the baddest cats on the planet. You know, and people say like, oh, I never see them or I never hear from them. Count your blessings. If you're not seeing them and you're not hearing from them and you're not crossing paths with them, that's probably a good thing.
If people want to learn more about Jay, read his book. And we'll put a link to that in the description.
His book, No Angel.
And there's all sorts of amazing, like the story of the brawl. Brawl is amazing. I'm not going to start because then I'll keep going. But we like to end all our interviews by asking the same question of everyone, and that is, what did we not ask you that we should have? If you were interviewing you, what would you ask you that we didn't?
Well, I always look for opportunities to comment, or when the question's like, well, what good came from this, right? On a personal level, it's beyond good for me. Is that all of this elevated my spirituality? I always had, or believed I had God in my life. But I didn't always live my life in a way that reflected that, you know, and I've made, man, a million mistakes in my life. I've done a million things wrong that I'm humiliated by or ashamed of. But God has given me 1,000,001 second chances to get it right. I know this in some of those hard times, you know, in some of those dangerous times, I learned that if the only time you're talking to God is when you're in trouble, you're in trouble. And I learned that the hard way. Like every time I needed a rescue, man, I was quick to start saying my prayers. And then I felt like I got it figured out. I'll handle it from here. I realized I'm not handling anything. I'm not figuring anything out. And the things that I do think I have figured out, I typically have wrong. So I'm very happy that that God is prevalent in my life and allowed me to continue my life with my family.
Jay Dobyns, thank you so much. I was really, really looking forward to this conversation, and it's been incredible.
He's been talking about it for weeks.
And it is a world and a universe that is incredibly fascinating to me. So thank you so much for your time and your candor.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys. To your audience, go out there, be amazing, go change the world, put your dent in the universe. Especially those lawmen and women that are listening to you too. Like, go out, love your God, love your families, love your partners, love your friends. But if I've given you anything, man, don't forget to love yourselves along the way. Police, suicide is epidemic, and don't feel like you're alone. Contact me. I'm easy to find. I'll help you get help.
How do people find you if they want to?
The easiest way is just through my email, and it's my personal email, and I'm happy to put it out there. It's azjdob@yahoo.com. I have a website that's jdobyns.com. My email is there, and by throwing that out there, someone may choose to get some help. Someone may use it to send me insults and threats. And you know what? If someone sends something, a message where they need help, for every one of those, if I get 100 insulting messages, the one is the one that's important, which makes it worthwhile sifting through all the bullshit.
You're a good man, Jay Dobyns. Thank you for spending time with us.
Thank you, guys.